Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Bay Nature Talk titled An Inside Look at Bay Area Bobcats. I'm Taylor Crisologo, Development Manager at Bay Nature, and I'm so grateful you could join us today. Bay Nature magazine has been connecting people in the Bay Area to local nature for over 20 years. We are a nonprofit that tells the stories of local nature through quarterly print magazines and online articles. This is our ninth talk as part of our ongoing Bay Nature Talk series, which are all available on our website's events page. Tonight's webinar is based on a photo essay by Sarah titled Country Cat, City Cat, which appears in our current issue. Before we begin, just a little housekeeping. If you have any technical difficulties, please know this webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent to you along with links to other Bobcat resources. If you have any questions during Sarah's talk, please enter them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we can after her presentation. We'd like to thank the David Brower Center in Berkeley for providing our technical support this evening. We'd also like to thank everyone who registered for the talk, and a special thank you to those of you who made the suggested $20 donation for tonight. Your support helps Bay Nature bring you these talks. Tonight's speaker is Sarah Killingsworth, a California naturalist and wildlife educator with Project Coyote. She is a frequent public speaker about coexistence with wildlife, particularly native predators. Her photography can be viewed at sarahkillingsworth.com. With that, please take it away, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone who is joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Taylor for that introduction and Bay Nature Magazine for running my photo essay on suburban bobcat and for hosting this talk. I'm really excited to share some more photos of this bobcat family and also talk about coexistence and wildlife photography in general. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So a little bit first about me. I am the program coordinator for Project Coyote's Keeping It Wild Youth Education and Outreach Program. I am a UC certified California naturalist, a conservation and wildlife photographer, and a member of the ethics committee of the North American Nature Photography Association. And today is Nature Photography Day for NAMPA. So it's a perfect day to be talking about photographing animals and wildlife in your neighborhood, including suburban bobcats. As Taylor mentioned, there's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A and Taylor will be asking me as many as we can get to after I do my presentation. And then the last thing is all of the photos of bobcats in this presentation were taken by me, and I use a long lens when I shoot, usually a 500mm lens. So although it appears that I'm very close to these cats, I'm not. I'm usually a good distance away, so they look a lot closer than they actually are. So bobcats are, surprisingly, our wild neighbors. As human development has spread into bobcat territories, bobcats have adapted and learned to live in suburban and urban areas. And that's true not just in California, but actually across the United States. Bobcats are in neighborhoods all around San Francisco, the North Bay, the East Bay, and the South Bay. Not in San Francisco itself, but all around the Bay Area. And when they're in suburban or, excuse me, urban areas, bobcats prefer to move around their territory using green belts or riparian areas and generally try and minimize their visibility by moving along the edges of brush or other structures or objects as much as possible. And one example of something that they might use to shield their movements that's different when they're in a suburban environment is in this photo. So in the wild, they might hug along the edge of coyote bush, but in a suburban neighborhood, they'll often walk alongside the curbs or beside a parked car. And so this is a parked car walking between the curb and the car. I wanted to start with a quote from Mary Oliver, who I love. And this is a photo of the same mom and one of her kittens that's in the Bay Nature photo essay. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. And this is mom with 3 kittens in the neighborhood. This is a green space in the neighborhood. And photographing this bobcat family has been one of the highlights of any wildlife photography opportunities I've ever had. This mother has been amazingly devoted to her kittens, and every time she leaves them to go hunt, excuse me, I apologize, my allergies have gotten bad in the last 2 days. Every time she leaves them to go hunt, when she comes back, she checks carefully to find each one. And when they're little, she'll bring them over to nurse. And then as they get older, she'll bring them kills and they will actually start eating those. But after she nurses them when they're little, like this in this photo, they get grooming sessions, and you can just see the sort of blissed out, vulnerable kitten here while mom is grooming its belly. And I love moments like this. And as the kittens get older, they will in turn groom her when she comes back. And there's just such a strong bond that it's really just such a privilege to sit and observe the connection between the mother and her kittens. So I'm not assuming that everybody on this webinar has seen the photo essay that's in Bay Nature. So I just wanted to include a few fast facts about bobcats. This is a photo of one of her kittens. I'm not going to read all of these facts, but one thing I wanted to emphasize is that bobcats are territorial and they are solitary, except when they're a female raising their young. And one thing about bobcats in their territories is that they will have multiple den sites, and a bobcat mother will move her kittens regularly to keep them safe from predators and threats as they're growing up. And they will disperse usually around 9 months, between 9 months and a year. And during that period of time while they're with her, she'll move them around the territory. Bobcats will cross roads in the territory. So in a suburban environment, bobcats are looking for grassy areas with their preferred prey in it, and often have to cross a road to get from one section of the territory to another. They tend not to cross freeways or highways. So unlike mountain lions that have been shown to cross major highways, bobcats tend not to. And so what that means is their habitat ends up being fragmented and they're confined to within circles of those freeways. And also something called genetic bottlenecking, which means the number of other bobcats that they're able to reproduce with are limited to the ones that are within the periphery of those major highways. This is the bobcat mother from the photo essay, and she regularly crossed the road to find food for her kittens. I have probably hundreds of photos of this cat crossing the road. And she's really good. If you saw the photo essay, you see there's a picture of her sitting on the curb waiting to cross as a car goes by. So she was very conscientious about cars and teaching the kittens about cars. But road strikes are a major threat to bobcat survival in suburban areas. So it's really helpful in coexistence with these wonderful cats to make sure that you drive slowly, especially at dawn and dusk, and particularly if you're driving near parks or open spaces or riparian areas, because those are the areas that the cat will stay in until it needs to come out and cross over. And so if you slow down, you give wildlife a chance to get out of the road and get out of harm's way. This is another bobcat. This is not mom, this is a different cat. Again, crossing a road and there's a parked car behind it. In addition to cars, the other major threat to suburban bobcats has been rodenticide use. And so the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides that are used to poison a variety of rodents, including gophers, which is one of the bobcat's main source of food. Those poisons kill some predators through secondary poisoning. So those animals die when they eat prey that's been poisoned. And that's true of raptors and coyotes and foxes, as well as bobcats. But bobcats tend to have a higher tolerance for consuming the poison in the sense that it often doesn't kill them immediately and directly, but it builds up in their system, and it has two different impacts on their immune systems. It increases inflammation and it decreases their immune response. And there are a number of studies that have been done on suburban bobcats, and what they find is an incredibly high prevalence of these rodenticides in the bobcats' systems, and that they are far more susceptible to parasites and mange, which is a scabies, And those things would not normally kill a healthy bobcat, but mange has killed bobcats in Southern California in particular. There's a study about that. And so rodenticide exposure is a real problem for these cats. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity. I have volunteered in the past at Wild Care. I was able to go in and photograph this bobcat. It was originally found on someone's back deck, emaciated and starving, and they don't know for sure what happened, but they believe that its source of all of the parasites that it had was the fact that it had been exposed to rodenticides, and they actually didn't think it would survive. The good news is it got great care, and this photo that I took, which is it's about to get x-rayed to have its teeth checked. This is its exit pre-release exam. And so it actually was successfully re-released into the area where it was originally found and is healthy, but rodenticides were the likely cause of its illness when it ended up going into wild care. So this is another different bobcat in a road. I have, like I said, a number of different cats in photos of cats in the road, many photos of the mother cat that's part of the photo story, but also lots of other bobcats crossing the roads. They are far more prevalent in suburban areas than I think people normally would think that they are. So in terms of coexisting, it's really helpful to make sure that they have a safe way to cross the road. And that includes areas, either overpasses, wildlife overcrossings, or culverts or other underpasses that they can use. Wildlife friendly fencing, if it's alongside a road, allows the animals to go through the gaps in the wire or in the fence, as opposed to being pinned to the road with the fencing. And there's a study from the South Bay, a recent study about bobcats, that talks about the dangers of certain roads, and some of them aren't even highways, but they have concrete barriers in the middle and fencing on each side. And so if an animal including bobcats, gets into the middle of that road and a car comes, they don't have anywhere to go. They can't escape because they're pinned in between the fencing and the concrete barrier in the middle. And so that's a particularly deadly combination for bobcats and other animals. Another tip for coexistence is keeping your cats inside and your dogs on a leash, and also to keep your pet food and water inside. Having pet food or water outside tends to attract animals, not just bobcats, coyotes and foxes and other things too, but it increases the likelihood of conflict either with humans or their pets, and it also increases their tolerance of humans and their perception of humans as a food source, which can lead to road strikes and other harm to them. As I mentioned earlier, rodenticides are a significant risk and problem for bobcats and other predators and raptors. We're very lucky. California recently passed a law that went into effect at the beginning of this year that really limits the ability for anyone to use second generation rodenticides, but they can still be used for public health and food production facilities. So with some limited, very narrow exceptions, rodenticides can no longer be used by individuals or pest control companies. It used to be that individuals couldn't use them, but the pest control companies could. Another thing you can do to help coexistence is not feed or approach wildlife. So feeding wildlife is detrimental because, again, it acclimates them to humans. It causes them to seek human contact, which can lead to conflict or car strikes. One problem for bobcats in particular is that bobcats are only slightly larger than house cats, and from a weight perspective, lengthwise, they're longer and leaner, but the weight isn't particularly different. And people often, if they see a bobcat kitten, think that it could potentially be a domestic tabby kitten. And so sometimes people, thinking it's a feral cat, will either take it home or feed it. And that's really detrimental to the kitten because it doesn't learn to hunt if it becomes dependent on a human food source. And there was a few years ago, there was a bobcat, again in Marin County, that was actually scratching hikers on a trail, and bobcats attacking humans is virtually unheard of. It's incredibly, incredibly rare. I think there was one recent incident, and it was a rabid bobcat, which is also, excuse me, really unusual. Bobcats are not typical carriers of rabies. But in any event, this bobcat in Marin had been fed by neighbors at the trailhead when it was a kitten. And so it was clawing at hikers trying to get food. It was starving when it was brought into wild care. And unfortunately, because it had nipped at the heels of one of the hikers, they decided to euthanize it so they could test it for rabies. This bobcat did not have rabies. And again, they typically don't. But unfortunately, it was... by feeding it, they ended up, the people who were, I think, they thought they were helping the kitten by feeding it, ended up causing it to be euthanized. So if you ever see a bobcat kitten and you're concerned about whether it's being fed by its mother, the best thing you can do is call a wildlife rehabilitation center like Sonoma County Wildlife Rescue or Wild Care or Lindsay Wildlife Center, and somebody who has a lot of experience can come and assess or get a description from you about what's happening, because mother bobcats often leave kittens alone for extended periods of time. And by that, it can be even as long as 6 or 8 hours, depending on how long the hunting is taking. So finding a kitten by itself, like under a bush or hidden somewhere in a suburban area, is not a sign necessarily that it's been abandoned or that it's in trouble. And so really relying on expertise is important in helping them stay wild and healthy and alive as part of our wonderful neighborhood. In addition to the issues with feeding bobcats, approaching wildlife obviously is detrimental to them and increases their stress. And so if you're interested in photographing bobcats in your neighborhood, the best way to do that is to try and find a spot that allows you to observe as unobtrusively as possible. And I always prefer to sit low, sometimes even lie on the ground, and be really still and allow the animal's behavior to unfold. And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. And then the last piece of advice is to just share information with other people. There's a lot of misinformation that floats around about animals, native predators, bobcats in particular, on places like Nextdoor. And so there's a great benefit to sharing information with neighbors, sharing websites and resources to help everyone in the neighborhood get to know more about these great, wonderful bobcats. So a couple of just coexistence images. So this is a wildlife crossing area. This is a mock-up. Some of you might have seen the recent New York Times article. There's a transportation bill that's actually got a significant chunk of funds associated with building more of these wildlife crossing areas, in part because the car strikes also cause human mortalities and damage to cars. So they're looking to reduce them by building more wildlife crossing areas, which is a good thing for the wildlife. In talking about food, so I mentioned that bobcats eat gophers. So they're obligate carnivores. And what that means is they have to eat meat to survive. Their diet generally is going to consist of small mammals. So most commonly that's gophers, voles, rabbits, like cottontails, and hares, jackrabbits or hares. But they can eat and do eat birds, snakes, and lizards. Bobcats do not consume domestic pets like cats and dogs. They've done studies of bobcat scat and have never found evidence that a bobcat has actually consumed a domestic cat or a pet dog. But it is true that they do sometimes attack domestic pets, either to protect kittens or to defend their territory, because as I mentioned earlier, they are territorial. So again, it's important to keep cats inside and dogs on a leash, or to accompany your dogs if you're outside. This is one of the mom's kittens, and she has just plucked a gopher from a hole, which in the kitten learning to hunt is a good thing. This particular photo, though, when I took it, I had some concerns about this kitten because it went over to the hole and pawed at it a little bit and then dug its nose in and pulled the gopher up not quite at the angle you see it here, but close. And you can see it's pulling the gopher up by its face. The gopher was already dead when the kitten pulled it out of the hole. And I don't know, it could have died of natural causes right by the opening in its hole. It could have been poisoned, or it could have been injured but not killed by a great blue heron. So great blue herons also hunt gophers. They stab them with their beak and then eat them. And it's possible that a great blue heron tried to get it and injured it and missed. I didn't ever see any puncture mark on this gopher to suggest that it was, but it's possible something else caused it other than rodenticides. But it caused me concern to see the kitten pulling out a dead gopher, because potentially that's a poisoned gopher that's going to put those rodenticides in the kitten system as well. And then this is a bobcat with a vole, which is like a small field mouse. It's another common prey. Shifting a little bit from coexistence into when I was talking to Regina about doing this presentation, talking about how I take photos, how I take wildlife photos. And that's both, there's sort of a mental or psychological approach, as well as a physical approach and sort of a tech and gear approach. So I'm going to touch lightly on all those different things. And then depending on people's interest and questions, we can go deeper into any of them. So starting here with a quote from Buddha, do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment. And for me, that's really what wildlife photography is. It is focusing on being truly present in the moment and fully focused on whatever is in front of me. And that has been a tremendous gift, particularly in the last year and a half, to not worry about the past or about the future, and to be present in the in the moment and in the company of things like these bobcat kittens. In doing that, you're slowing down and really taking notice of your environment and to changes in the area. So if you're going out and looking for even bobcats in your neighborhood, you're going to be looking for signs of bobcats and really noticing what's going on in your neighborhood. And that is a slowing down. We usually rush around with a million things to do. And so it's a really nice opportunity to just change the pace a little bit. And then if you see something that you're interested in observing or photographing, being able to sit quietly and still, again, in our at times hectic paced world, is just, it's really a gift to be able to sit and observe them. And then in sitting and watching, you tend to have moments where you observe behavior that you haven't seen before or you wouldn't have expected. And you can learn to anticipate behavior for the next time you see that animal, which is, from just a curiosity standpoint, I always think it's fascinating and interesting. And then from a photography standpoint, it can help in taking better photos and knowing what might come next. So scanning for wildlife or sitting in the same spot on a daily or weekly basis gives you an understanding of what the baseline is in that environment. And a lot of people use baseline to talk about, behavior or vocalizations. I also think of it as a visual. There's a lot you can learn by repeatedly visiting the same place and noticing then what changes at different times of day, at different months of the year or seasons of the year. And you can really appreciate when something has changed. And often the things that are changing are the animals. In addition to foliage might change, temperature, winds, other things, but animals moving through and hunting or raising young, those are going to change with the seasons. Another thing that's really fascinating, if you're interested in observing behavior closely, is not just if you're a birder, but even if you're focused on mammals, learning to understand bird calls. There's a wonderful book John Young wrote called What the Robin Knows. And it talks about understanding bird communication, not just in terms of what it means to that bird, but what it communicates to other species as well. And as humans, by observing bird behavior and their calls, we can learn a lot about what's happening in an environment. And for example, I know just from my own personal experience in sitting with wildlife, that a scrub jay calling is a really good indicator that there's a disturbance, and it's very often a gray fox or a bobcat, depending on where you're sitting, if that's a spot that they frequent. So they sort of announce the arrival of other species. And the more time you spend in a particular area, the better able you are to discern which animals are coming based on some of the sounds that the birds make, even if those are the same birds that are there all the time. The other thing about bobcats is they camouflage really, really well. People ask me all the time, how do you see bobcats? I mean, you say they're here, but I don't see them ever or very rarely. And definitely this is something where practice really, really helps, and patience. But practice in seeing bobcats, because a lot of the time what's visible, if you look at this photo, the cat is very close in color to the grass. And if the grass were taller in front of its face, it might be that all you could see would be the ears and the little black tufts at the top of the ears. And that's often true when I'm out scanning for bobcats. What I see is just little tips of ears or just a little bit of an outline of the cat's head. And so if you're out looking for a full body of a bobcat in a field, you might not find it. But if you know the kinds of places they frequent and know after you've seen them a few times in different situations, different settings, and you get a sense, it helps train your brain and your eyes to look for them in that way. And that really helps. So the more practice you get, the better. In talking about how I take the photos, for me, one of the things that's really important is the ethics in wildlife photography, and particularly about having empathy for the animals that we're photographing. Anyone who goes out looking for wildlife is probably interested in learning about behavior, observing interesting things, and perhaps getting a great photo. And those are all fine and appropriate goals. And at the same time, the animal that we're observing or photographing, their only goal is survival. Every day, every hour, every minute, they're focused on whether they are getting something to eat, they are using up calories for something they recently ate, and whether they're reproducing or avoiding threats or predators. And having empathy for that and understanding that doing things that causes them to burn up energy that they've had to work hard to get food to give them the energy, that comes at a cost to that animal. And so I never want my presence to cause any further expenditure of energy. So by being present, it's a disruption. Humans are a disruption in a wild environment, and even our suburbs are a disruption of a habitat. But beyond that, it is really always my goal to not change an animal's behavior. Once they've noticed me, it's to hopefully be as benign and uninteresting as a rock in a field, and then let them go about their business. Saying all of that, I do also want to acknowledge that even with best of intentions, we all make mistakes, including me. I'm not perfect. And there have been times where I have not noticed or seen either another photographer or an animal in the field, or I've come around a corner not expecting it to be right where it is and come closer than I would have ever intended to. And so mistakes happen, but I try to be mindful of the animal's needs and not cause a disturbance or stress in that animal. It can be really helpful to spend time observing the wildlife before you start taking photos. So even if you want to take photos, if you slow down and just watch for a little bit, you get two things out of that. One is that the animal will perceive you as a visual disturbance, but then may resume its normal behavior. If you're both a visual and an audible disturbance, then it may view you as a higher level threat and have a higher level stress response and potentially flee. If you're quiet at first, it may then settle down. And then if you later take photos, that noise is just the only new disturbance that it perceives. The other thing about observing wildlife before you take photos is anticipating, again, where the animal might go or what it might do. And so a lot of wildlife has habits, patterns. Coyotes will hunt a field in a zigzag pattern. And so if you watch them for a while, you can sort of know which way they're going to go next and put yourself in a position that's in good light and a reasonable distance and all the things you would want for a good photo. And you get that by watching for a little while before you start shooting. I love using my car as a blind if I can, and especially with suburban wildlife, it's usually pretty easy. You just have to find a spot to park, but you can pull over and shoot out your window. And for animals that are living in suburban or urban areas, they're used to cars, especially parked cars. Moving cars are dangerous, but parked cars are all around them. So it's a really good way to be able to observe and take photos of an animal without increasing its stress levels at all. If you are outside a car and wanted to approach a bobcat or other wildlife for photography, it's important to never walk directly towards them. And it's also helpful to avoid looking directly at them. So predators have two eyes in the front, and when you stare at something, that's an indication that you view that thing potentially as prey. And so a bobcat will perceive you staring directly at it as a threat. And so again, it's better to avoid directly looking at them and sort of use your peripheral vision to get yourself in position, and again, not walk directly towards it. Finding a spot that's a reasonable distance away is then, trying to think about light and other things that I'll talk about in a minute, but getting low and staying really quiet. Again, trying to cause as little disturbance as possible. And I always try and familiarize myself with the signs of stress for whatever animal I'm photographing. So it differs by species, and different animals within the same species have different tolerances. So some bobcats are more skittish than others, but a bobcat's stress response, if it is stressed, is to flatten down to the ground as flat as it can make itself, including its little ears, and just try and disappear into the grass. That's a first level response. So if you roll up in your car and park by the side of the road and there's a bobcat and it flattens down, that's telling you that it's already slightly stressed. And so if you get out of the car or move towards it in any way, it's going to run. And it's much better to sit for a minute and just see, because that initial stress response sometimes is dismissed quite quickly. If it stays down for a long period of time, then you're continuing to stress it and it's better to move on. But sometimes they'll flatten and then decide that there's not a problem and get back up and go about hunting. So that's, a good thing to know in any animal, including bobcats, is just what's the sign of stress. And a secondary sign of stress, so if the perceived threat is a higher level of threat, a bobcat will run. So first they'll flatten down and try and disappear. But if they're truly stressed, they'll run, and then that means they're really in distress from the presence of either you or your vehicle, or if it's a group of people. This is just an example of using a car as a blind. So I have a beanbag that goes over my car door, and you can rest your lens on it, and it gives good stability, and also, again, lets you take pictures on a stable surface, but from a blind, that an animal that's especially in a suburb, something they're used to. This is a neighborhood bobcat. I took this photo from my car, out the car window. You can't see it, but immediately to the right of the frame of this photo is asphalt, is the road. So this pine litter is just literally the side of the road that the cat is walking up. Being low and quiet and unobtrusive allows an animal to relax and then continue on with their natural behavior. And so I have some photos to share. They're not all of the suburban bobcat family that was in the photo essay, but just some behavioral images to give you a sense of what different things might look like or what to look for. So a bobcat, when it's hunting, will often sit over a gopher hole for 20 minutes or more. And it will at times be motionless while it's doing that. It's eventually, though, if it's going to leap or lunge, it will crouch down the way this one is And then right before it pounces, it'll flatten its ears to its head the way this cat has done. And so if you know that, that's a really good sign to change the settings on your camera if you're taking photos, because if you've had it at a slower shutter speed because the cat was sitting still, you want to up your shutter speed and probably increase your f-stop to give yourself a little bit more room for the focal length so that when it jumps, you hopefully get the cat in focus, which is of course always key. And so this cat did indeed leap a minute later and came up with this gopher, and then walked towards me a little bit. I had been out in the field for a long time, just sitting in the same spot, and it had been hunting around me. Got up, turned towards me with the gopher, and then walked off down the hillside and sat down next to a bush to eat its meal. This is a bobcat grooming in a front yard. So like our domestic cats, bobcats wash their faces by licking their paws and then wiping their face. So that's what she's doing. This is a different bobcat grooming after a meal. So most often after they eat a gopher or a vole, they will lick their lips, lick their chops, as they say, and wash their face, and sometimes do a full body grooming session, but sometimes just the face and paws. Another behavior that's fun to see is scratching. So bobcats do scratch, and typically on trees or logs, and it's not just a sharpening of claws, but it's actually a scent marking. So it helps mark territory for cats. And so this picture right here shows you the disadvantage of a fixed focal length large lens. This happened really fast, and if I had turned my camera, I could have tried to get a vertical shot, but I wouldn't have gotten the whole cat in it anyway. So this is a half cat image from a photography standpoint, not an amazing photo, but I liked the behavior and I wanted to share it because I think it's cool to see. This is mom, adult female bobcat, scratching a tree in a yard that had her kittens in it. And then that behavior is also shared by the kittens. But this is a more suburban setting. This is the kitten scratching on someone's side deck. So you can see the little sharp claws there, scratching into the wood. And then one of my favorite behaviors to observe is rolling. So bobcats will roll in the dirt. It's not super common, but it does happen sometimes after a successful hunt. Lots of mammals use dirt or dust baths to get rid of parasites. So there's probably, that's partially what is going on, but I have to say that sometimes it really just looks like it feels good to scratch their back and roll. And bobcats don't really smile, but I do think there's an element of just happiness or contentment that goes along with that. So this is mom rolling in the grass. And then to quickly touch on gear and settings, and we can talk more about this if there are questions, but I wasn't sure that everyone would be interested, so we're just going to go through it a little bit. For wildlife photography, and particularly for an animal like bobcats that tend to be skittish, it really helps to have a long lens, 300 millimeters or 500 millimeters. I know they can be pricey. It is possible to rent one, so if you have a trip that you might want to have the lens for just a little while, that can be helpful. And in some situations, people bring their phones out and try and take photos of wildlife with that, but you're never really going to get a portrait from that. And so it means getting too close, which isn't really good for you or the wildlife. In terms of camera settings, I talked earlier about shutter speed and f-stops, and just making sure that you have a shutter speed that's fast enough to capture the movement, especially of like a hunting or moving cat. And then optimizing light, the light that you're shooting in. So early and late in the day is generally best. Shooting with the sun behind you while you're facing the subject is preferable, but side lighting and backlighting where the sun is coming from the side or behind the subject can also be pretty cool. The photo essay actually had a backlit photo that I took of mom leaping for a kill. So it can be a cool effect. And last thing about just photography and composition is shifting your perspective to improve the background. So as you look at the background in your viewfinder, sometimes there's a distracting thing in the image. And if you move to the right or the left or up or down slightly, you can remove that thing that distracts from your primary focus in the photo. So it's always worth playing around a little bit and see if you can remove those distractions. And so being at or near eye level makes for more dramatic photos. This is a hunting bobcat. And having the background and foreground be out of focus will draw the eye immediately to the thing that's sharp in the image. So in this case, that's the bobcat's face, and she's hunting. This is a gopher hole in the right side of the photo. And this is a side lit photo. It's also a body posture that head turned to the side is a little bit more dramatic. So just another example. And then just two quick last things. One, talking a little bit more about Project Coyote, and if you're interested in learning more about coexistence with native predators, not just bobcats, but other native predators, Project Coyote has a lot of great programs. Coyote Friendly Communities program, helping educate people about coyotes and coyote behavior in suburban and urban areas. The Keeping It Wild Youth Education and Outreach program that I coordinate, which pre-COVID, we do classroom presentations, and during COVID, it's been mostly webinars, but looking forward to getting back in the classroom for that, and also have curriculum and other resources for teachers on the website. And then the Ranching with Wildlife program, helping ranchers and agricultural properties coexist with cats. Project Coyote has two national campaigns I just wanted to mention. One is a national campaign to end wildlife killing contests. If you don't know what they are, you can go to the website and check it out. They're horrific. And a number of states have been banning them. Project Coyote is working really hard to have them be banned in all states. And they're working on a national campaign to relist the gray wolves to protect them again. And if you wanted to do a deeper dive into some of the things I've been talking about, I did a webinar on bobcats in general, not just suburban bobcats, but bobcats overall. And I was on a panel along with Melissa Grew and Daniel Dietrich on ethics in predator photography. And so that's also on the Project Coyote website. And then I've done a couple of recent radio or podcast interviews. The first one for Resistance Radio was about bobcats, and the Wilderness and Wildlife Radio interview is about bobcats and photography ethics. And with that, I am going to let Taylor take up some of the questions that have come in while I've been talking.
Wow, Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. And your photos are beautiful. It's just, it was just such a joy to watch. So we have a lot of questions that came through during the presentation that are coming through now. We may not have time to get to all of them, but let's start off with this one. So what does it take to have wildlife crossing signs put near roads where you know bobcats are crossing?
Well, so it depends where you are. So road signs are generally going to, it depends on the type of road and the type of community. So often that's a county thing. So you'd need to talk to, if you have like a county board of supervisors, somebody there. I've seen people in a neighborhood that I'm often in have put up homemade signs that are on poles that are for other signs. And I suppose if it's in your front yard, you could put a sign up wherever you want, but you usually, to actually put a true road sign up, you'd have to go through a governmental entity, either the city, if you're in a city, or if it's a county road and you're in the unincorporated parts of a county, you'd have to go through the county.
Thanks, that's good to know and a good resource to have. And so moving on to our next question here too. So just talking about our future a little bit, what does the bobcat's future look like given the mega drought, climate change, urbanization, et cetera? In this season, where are they getting water?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that. So bobcats are actually present in all 48 contiguous lower states. So with the exception of Delaware that they only transition in and out of. But talking just about California, bobcat populations have been really hard for people to study and therefore hard for people to estimate. The general expectation is that the bobcat population is stable or growing. California is a good place to be a bobcat because we have banned bobcat hunting. So there's no trophy hunting of bobcats here, which is still permitted in many states. There's no bobcat trapping for fur trapping, which is also permitted in many states. And we do not have wildlife killing contests, which bobcats are one of the many prime targets in wildlife killing contests. So California's population of bobcats is probably overall doing better than a lot of other states. And we just banned rodenticide use with some very narrow exceptions, or at least the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So that said, there isn't a really good estimate of what the numbers are. So it's hard to say exactly what the trend is, but there are people using trail cameras and other systems trying to track and monitor bobcat populations, but it's, again, it's I'm not going to say conjecture, but it's not hard numbers. They're pretty elusive animals, so it's hard to track them. And then Taylor, I think the second part of the question asked about like resources, like fresh water and the drought and things like that.
Yeah. Like this season, have you noticed where they're getting their water sources from?
So it's interesting. Suburban animals go to suburban water sources. So if you have a neighbor who's got a leaky sprinkler that like makes a puddle in their yard, there's wildlife probably coming to that leaky sprinkler. And if you have a little seasonal creek running through a center median in your neighborhood, the animals are probably going down there. So they're pretty adept at finding water sources. It's one of the reasons that leaving water out for your pets can attract wildlife, because then they realize that there's a water source in your yard and may come into your yard seeking water. And then if you have a pet that's outside, it may lead to conflict. Even if the bobcats don't consume them, it could create a conflict. So.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I live near the San Ramon Creek and I saw a red fox there using the creek too. So the suburban animals are definitely finding their water sources.
Yeah, and as the drought continues, I think the pressure on the existing remaining water sources will get more intense.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, moving on to kind of a bobcat encounter question. So I've encountered juvenile bobcats twice recently. They were walking on a trail. I stood still until they walked off the trail and into the bushes. Is this the best response, or is there something else I should do?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds appropriate. I can't tell from the question how far away that person is. But generally, if they're not, if an animal is approaching you, then I think it's generally best to step back. And the general wisdom is, to give them a good bit of distance. So you don't, if an animal were walking right up to your shoes, you wouldn't want to let it get that close to you. But assuming they were just on the trail and visible from where someone is standing, if you're not causing it distress and they're clearly on a path to somewhere, I think that just being present and quiet and not threatening is a good response for that.
Thanks, Sarah. I still have yet to see a bobcat on one of my hikes. I'm really crossing my fingers, but that's helpful.
They're out there.
They are. Yeah, so I had a lot of questions about rodenticides, but here's just
okay.
Are all rodenticides bad? What about pellets that are put down a gopher hole?
So I am not an expert on chemicals or rodenticides overall. What I will say is that there were rodenticides that were the quote first generation rodenticides that killed animals. So they're anticoagulants. So that means they stop blood clotting. So these animals are literally bleeding to death internally. That's what's happening with animals that are poisoned with that type of rodenticide. The first generation one had some problems associated with it. And so they didn't let people continue using that. And so they created these second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. They take longer to kill the animals. And so, but the bottom line is the chemical that they consume, another animal, if it eats that prey, will get that same poison in their system. And so, yes, I would say those chemicals are always bad. They're bad for the rodents and they're bad for anything else that might live by eating those rodents. I know, I have done a little bit of research. I do know that some of the gopher poisons are in fact second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, so they are the bad ones. I think, the general wisdom is if you have pests that you have to eradicate, so, mice or rodents, there are better ways than rodenticides, whether they're the sort of electric zapper traps or other deterrents and traps to try and eliminate the problem without putting a poison into the ecosystem, because once it goes into that animal, the odds are pretty high it will then continue on into other things in that ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And not just bobcats, other animals too, right? Like I know a lot about raptors and they're having issues.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's a problem for foxes, coyotes, owls, hawks. They regularly find raptors, and raptors are the solutions, an organization that's been working really hard and worked hard on the rodenticide ban here in California, because we have great natural control for rodents with our predators. And so if we have healthy populations of our native predators, they will eat the gophers. And, that's why people put up owl boxes. The owls will eat the gophers, the coyotes will eat them. And so there are better alternatives than those poisons.
Thanks, Sarah. Kind of switching gears a little bit here too. So I got a question. How and when did you first get interested in bobcats?
Oh, goodness. So like, where to start? How much time do we have? No. So I've always loved wildlife, and I've always loved cats, in particular, wild cats. And I don't even know when I started really being focused on them. Certainly once I started doing wildlife photography, which I would say was, somewhere around 7 years ago. More seriously, some people come into wildlife photography from a passion for photography first, and then the wildlife piece is sort of second. I came at it in the other direction. So I was passionate about wildlife and coexistence and animal behavior, and really excited about trying to find ways to share those images and that behavior, things I was lucky enough to see that I wanted other people to get to see too. And so I then got into photography for that. For that purpose. So yeah, I think bobcats, it was almost sort of the more time I spent with them, the more I fell in love with them. They're such strong, graceful, patient, beautiful animals. And then seeing the bond between a bobcat mother and her kittens is just remarkable.
Yeah, I bet. And just kind of rolling into our next question too. So what has been your favorite bobcat moment?
It's really hard to choose, but I have to say that one of the times that the bobcat mother in that photo essay, that she came back from hunting, and her kittens were quite small, probably 5 or 6 weeks old. She came back and all 3 kittens came bounding out of the den to nurse. And one of them, sort of after a little bit of nursing, climbed up over her back and then sort of did a somersault around her head and ended up in front of her. And she started licking it, and it was licking her, and then it went back to nursing. But it was just this sweet little intimate moment of a little bit of a rambunctious kitten. I mean, that's one of the fun things too, is these kittens have personalities, right? I mean, they're different, each of them. And so seeing which one's the spunky one, and which one's the more cautious one, it's really a treat to sit and watch.
I can imagine. It's making me smile over here just hearing it through you. So I I can only imagine that experiencing that firsthand is just really cool.
It is. It's a gift.
Yeah, well, it looks like we are just running out of time here. I apologize that we only had time to cover just a few of our many and wonderful questions. Um, but I think, yeah, we'll need to wrap things up. I just wanted to say, please keep an eye out for our next Bay Nature Talk to those of you in the audience. Thank you to everyone, and if you enjoyed our free webinar, please consider contributing at baynature.org. And thank you again to Sarah and the Brower Center. Your presentation was just wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add, Sarah?
No, I just a huge thank you again to everyone for attending and being interested in these just incredible cats and coexistence, and to Bay Nature for shining a spotlight on bobcats and particularly suburban bobcats. I'm really grateful.
It was a pleasure having you, and it's just, again, just awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and have a great evening.
Thank you.